Luther and Calvin were just some of the most prominent Protestants to challenge the way in which the Roman Catholic Church was working in Western Europe in the time period of the 16th century. There are many others, but they are all in many ways interconnected with the idea that they are looking at the way in which the church used to operate. They're finding some areas that are of great disagreement, and then they're using that as a justification for why they need to set off in their own way, their own sense of pursuing their own purity. And for many of them, that is involving a clear and full understanding of the Holy Scriptures within the Christian movement, and then finding a way to use them as the vehicle. And for many of them, that means that is in the process of moving forward, it's going to be even more and more complex as we go. I mean, think of it this way. It's very difficult to get people to agree about much of anything, and when it comes down to something like politics or religion, well, I'll let you leave your own devices to that. But what we have here then is a religious diversity issue in Europe, and this color-coded map is going to kind of help us show us at least some of the divergences, and then we'll talk some more about some of the other characters involved in this process. Now, on this map, it is very simply trying to lay out for you in sort of a kaleidoscope of colors that there is emerging here by 1600 a significant religious diversity, not only between the Lutherans, the Calvinists, and the Roman Catholics, but there's even more complexity to that in terms of how are people going to learn to tolerate each other. Remember, most of European development, especially the ideas of feudalism, were always the idea that everybody is Christian in a society and that everybody who's Christian in that society follows the dictates of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. Well, that idea is now gone as we increasingly have political figures take over control of many of the areas of that they already control as monarch or as prince, and then now taking over the religious buildings and the churches in their areas as well. So now you have the creation of essentially an idea where the religion of the prince is going to match the religion of the people. And this is a concept that's been growing, but as there's more and more religious groups created, it's going to make that simplicity fall apart very quickly. That the Europeans, for lack of a better term, are going to have to wrestle with what to do with toleration. If there are various kinds of Christians in your area, how are you going to deal with the diversity? Now, just remember, within European history, they've already had a difficult time dealing with various kinds of pagans, various groups of Jews, various groups of Muslims. So now that they have, in many ways, created various kinds of Christianities, it's going to make it much more complex and difficult for everybody. But in terms of this map, we still have the traditional Eastern Orthodox area that has, of course, broken away and been separate from the Roman Catholic thinking for many, many centuries. We, of course, have the inclusion now of a larger Ottoman Empire, bringing in Muslim authority and power into southeastern Europe. We have areas of mixed belief, of Catholic with various kinds of other Protestant isms, and there's multiple. There's some places that are sort of more exclusively Lutheran, for example, here in Scandinavia. And then there are other ideas. Remember, Henry VIII had started, and his daughter Elizabeth I will conclude the full creation of a distinct Episcopal church in England. And then, of course, you have the ideas of John Knox and others from the Calvinist movement, in green here, eventually being exported and taken back to Scotland to create what's going to be called Presbyterianism. And then, of course, there's large areas of the continuation of traditional Roman Catholic belief. So just from the complexity viewpoint, right, this map is going to show us how difficult it's going to be for European political powers to be both politically powerful and obey the sort of religious ideas of their people. This is a portrait of King Henry IV of France. He is from a small community in the mountains of the Pyrenees called Navarre, but through a series of marriages and lots of different issues with death and monarchies don't always last unless there's a full-fledged son to replace, right? Well, Henry is going to emerge by the latter part of the 16th century as King of France, but he is going to be from the Huguenot group of people. Huguenots are it's the French name for the followers of John Calvin. They were a minority in many places in France, but they were in many ways a substantial minority in some places. Henry had been converted from Roman Catholic Christian belief to Calvinistic Christian belief, and in France those people are called Huguenots. He, by a series of accidents, becomes king of France, and the very first thing he does is he transforms himself from being a Calvinist Christian to a Roman Catholic Christian. So this is something that's going to happen oftentimes in this time period across Europe. Princes or princesses, for various reasons, will change their religious loyalties, and oftentimes those religious loyalties are changed to align with political reality. So we have to, in many ways, sort of, as historians, take a step back and go, okay, did Henry have a sincere conversion experience, or did he realize that he would have a better chance of controlling France as a Roman Catholic and not as a Huguenot? Those are going to be some of the difficult questions as we look into the history of this time period, because there will be many royal families and princes individually who will make decisions on religion. Okay? So, Henry IV, he is going to end the wars of religion by 1594. He's going to convert to Roman Catholic Christianity to control France, and he will do so until 1610 when he will be assassinated. That's a long story, but eventually he will be assassinated because people do not trust his religious belief. What's also happening is in places like what you know as the modern-day Belgium, northern France, and what is called the Dutch Republic or the Netherlands, as well as some small city-states along the edge of what you know as modern-day Germany. That kind of area of Europe, there is a huge diversity of religious belief there. There's a big mix of Roman Catholic. There's a significant Jewish minority in some of the cities there. There are a significant number of people who are Lutheran. There are also people who are followers of John Calvin, Calvinism. And in time, there are going to be other groups that will expand as well. So that the religious diversity question, which for the most part in Europe has not been a big issue, is now back. How will you tolerate, how will you deal with people who have different religious belief systems? In the case of the Netherlands, they are going to start to urge the idea that they can distinctively set themselves apart from their Roman Catholic overlords in Spain, and there's going to be a long civil war. Eventually, though, after 1566, what you're going to be knowing as the modern Republic of the Netherlands or the Dutch Republic is emerging. It in part is founded by military resistance, backed up by religious resistance to the outside overlordship and control of the Spanish, okay, the Habsburg family that's influencing them. This is then that correlation again. We have politics and religion coming back together, and they will eventually emerge and through a series of long drawn-out wars eventually become independent by 1609, although not fully represented until about 40 years later. But what I want to show there then is that this religious diversity that was at first sort of Luther and then expanded to Calvin, there's also Martin Butzer and there's Ulrich Zwingli. There are more and more of these Protestant thinkers across Europe. Right? One of the key ones that will be very influential in English history and Scottish history, and then of course America by historical connection, will be that, remember, John Knox had spent some time in the city of Geneva where John Calvin had set up his theocracy, the idea that you should impose religious belief on people as the best thing to help them guide themselves to salvation. It had a sense of great intoleration because it did not recognize the rights and abilities of others to have religious thought of another kind. But John Knox is going to take that idea back to Scotland in the time period after he's working with the people in Geneva. And increasingly what's going to happen is that Presbyterianism will grab a hold of the religious folks in Scotland. The Roman Catholic Church in Scotland will go into great decline. And if the monarchy of Scotland remains loyal to Roman Catholicism, and they were closely linked to French Roman Catholics, and most of the population is increasingly Presbyterian, a form of Calvinism, there's going to be a disconnect there. Same sort of thing, of course, in England, where if there are Roman Catholics and Henry has now moved over to Henry VIII has moved over to a different religious settlement, there are going to be some significant problems. Last thing to note here, Eastern Orthodoxy continues to be very powerful in Europe, especially in Russia and Romania and Bulgaria and other places in Eastern Europe. That, of course, is using a different Cyrillic alphabet from the Byzantine tradition and is in many ways not involved in the larger schemes of the Reformation and Renaissance as the Western Europeans are. All right? Take a look at this key element in the time period of European history, where essentially we have a grand religious fragmentation, and all European states are going to be challenged to think about how do you tolerate. What are the limits of persecution of religious groups? How far do you want to go? Does it mean expulsion? Does it mean forced conversion? These are lots of things to come as we move forward. Another key element to think about here, for those of you thinking about American history, remember many of the early American colonies are founded by religious groups who have been excluded or encouraged to leave Europe. And we'll have a little bit more on that later. But for now, take a look at this key area and time frame of European development and see if there's any of the sample questions that can assist you in pulling together your knowledge on this area.